Welcome. In this module I'd like to briefly talk about sustainability and the different meanings it has and why it is an interesting concept from an education point of view. I will be taking on a competence perspective. First, I think we should recognize that sustainability and greening are not entirely without controversy. Many people use it with different ideological intentions underneath, and this makes it a rather ill-defined concept. Of course, we do know that there are some basic definitions about sustainability. Generally, it's about harmonizing ecology, environment, economy, and ethics, if you can also include those definitions that find the normative aspects of sustainability quite critical and crucial. So definitions like the one behind me are quite typical, and you can find them in many documents, articles about sustainability. Andrew Dobson at one time documented, I think, over 200 different definitions already in the late 1990s. So it is an ill-defined concept, which doesn't mean that we can neglect it, because the issues sustainability tends to refer to are quite urgent. Whether these are related to climate change, food security, loss of biodiversity, they're urgent sustainability problems. We must find a way to deal with them. There's, of course, agreement among scientists about what is going on to the state of the planet and what we should be doing about it, but there's also disagreement, not just in science but also in society. The recent IPCC report suggests with quite clear language that something very serious is happening to our planet, but the one before, a few years earlier, led to quite some debate, heated debate in society and in politics about how much trust we should put in reports like that. It is even more difficult when companies that may have an interest in not changing the current system of which we are part, because they have an interest in keeping it the way it is, because they stand to gain, at least in the short term, from, for instance, remaining dependent on fossil fuels. So some of the doubt might be cultivated intentionally, as this book, Merchants of Doubt, that is behind me, describes in a very interesting way. The way sustainability is used in the corporate world is also interesting to analyze. The language that is being used here, Volkswagen uses in an advertisement the word sustainable in a quite different way. Sustainable excitement to promote its hybrid car. But that same Volkswagen also manipulated the testing results of its diesels. We know about Dieselgate, which also undermines the trust citizens might put in not only these companies but also in the word sustainability. Lots of controversies and contradictions, and I think part of education for sustainability and understanding sustainability is to critically reflect on these different meanings and uses of language. Questions like the ones behind me, you could call they're hopelessly ill-defined, or they're attractively vague. Attractively vague means that we need to find answers by looking for them in the context where we live. What might be sustainable in Kampala, Uganda, may not be sustainable in Wageningen, the Netherlands, where I am today. These are questions, like are vegetables grown in cities healthy, that are very much time and context and place specific. They do not have one single answer. Now you could say we do know a lot about what is unsustainable and what might be sustainable, but there's also a lot unknown about what might be unsustainable or what might be sustainable. So this makes it a very messy area for education and learning. It's not like teaching about photosynthesis or Newton's laws. If we look at toxics in rivers, it is clear that dumping toxic waste in a river is unsustainable. We could also say biking to work instead of taking the car. We know that is more sustainable under most circumstances. But there are also things that we may thought were sustainable, like asbestos. If we had the word back then when we came up with using asbestos in housing, roofing, it would fireproof, it would insulate. You could say, well, that was really a sustainable idea. But then later we find out that asbestos can cause all kinds of health problems and can be very dangerous. So it turns out to be unsustainable. So some things that we might think are sustainable today might be unsustainable, turn out to be unsustainable tomorrow. Windmills are an example. Some of these are more than 500 years old. They weren't created with sustainability in mind, but now we can say that they turn out to be quite sustainable. So that's an example of unknown at the time, but sustainable as it turns out. And then there are some things that we may not know yet. We just don't know. Wi-Fi, maybe that turns out to be very sustainable, unsustainable, or unhealthy. We don't know. And the same can be said about things that we think are sustainable today, like solar panels. But maybe if we look into a little deeper, or maybe with changes in the resource base, or some light earth or rare earth metals becoming scarce, it may turn out that these panels may not be so sustainable. We don't know, but we may find out in time. Critical in understanding sustainability and becoming more sustainable is that we start thinking about the role of education, culture, and science in advancing or accelerating sustainability, or unsustainability for that matter. Behind me you could say there's a timeline for education for sustainability. Don't have time to get into that now. And preceding to that time, that there's a whole history of environmental education, and at the moment there's some kind of convergence which some people refer to as education, or ESE, you could call that environmental and sustainability education, where they come together and they seek to respond to the new sustainable development goals. Here are 17 of them, and you probably are familiar with them. And 2 of those 17 have to do with interaction, with bringing people together, with teaching and with learning. Number 4, looking at improving quality education, and not just any education, but education with people and planet in mind. And number 17 is the role of partnerships and vital coalitions in moving towards sustainability. They also have to do with multi-stakeholder learning, bringing people together with diverse backgrounds to respond to these wicked sustainability challenges. It might be more interesting to look at sustainability from a competence or capacity building perspective. What are the abilities, the sustained abilities that we need? Here, from a paper that we did for a book on sustainability citizenship, I did this with Frans Lenglet, we distinguish 4 areas of sustainability competence. One having to do with the dynamics of sustainability, understanding the concept itself. One having to do with the critical dimension of sustainability, asking difficult questions, critiquing, breaking and disrupting unsustainable routines, analyzing normativity. Another one with change and innovation, entrepreneurship, unlocking creativity, but also adaptation, resilience, and what you could call agency or empowerment, so that people feel that they can make a difference either as an individual or as a collective. And finally, and perhaps the most important one, the normative dimension, where people think about what drives them, what's the meaning of life, to what end do we have education, to what end do we work and contribute to the economy. Do we accelerate quality of life, or do we live within the boundaries of our planetary ecosystems? How do we learn to live within those limits, but also how do we learn to care for each other, future generations, and for other species? So this has to do with ethics and moral questions. In the end, you could say that sustainability requires first and foremost our ability to learn continuously from a journey towards a world that is more equitable, fair, and pleasant, bearing in mind the well-being and the constraints of people and planet in all its diversity, and not just now, but also in the future. It's just as much about learning to be and to live within boundaries and to live within limits as it is about development, innovation, and change.